The Republic of Venice. It was officially founded in the early Middle Ages, and had lasted all the way until 1797. It is a remarkable example of maritime skill, political savvy, and cultural flourishing. You see, Venice became a major trading hub, enabling extensive trade between Europe and the Byzantine Empire, or Eastern Roman Empire, and the Islamic world, mainly thanks to its advantageous location on the northeastern coast of Italy along the Adriatic Sea. Its longevity and resilience against many enemies, well, to name a few, the Ottoman Empire and of course the other Italian city-states, were made possible by its unique oligarchic system, which was centered on the Doge and the Great Council. The Republic's strong navy and strategic control of important sea lanes, which supported its economic supremacy, further increased its wealth and power. But in spite of its remarkable history, the Republic of Venice was ultimately overthrown by Napoleon Bonaparte himself in 1797 as a result of changing trade dynamics, internal conflict, and external pressures from the new European powers. Regardless, Venice's architectural beauty, artistic contributions, and complex political systems all bear witness to this enduring legacy, and it continues to influence contemporary governance and cultural appreciation. And let's talk all about it today. Welcome to the channel, everybody. For the newcomers, good to have you with me for the first time. Those returning, good to have you back. Especially the gentleman, I assume, who keeps commenting, "Do a history of Venice," over and over again in many of these videos. I do appreciate your comments, so I have eventually gotten around to it. I'm not sure if by the time this video is released you're still commenting, but if you are, this is for you. And so, let's start, not from the traditional founding, but a little bit before. Of course, Venice wasn't just some empty plain before its traditional founding. In fact, the early history of the Republic of Venice is traditionally dated to the dedication of the city's first church, and that was supposedly on March 25th, AD 421. But there is a bit of a problem with that. There's no contemporary documents that survive to confirm this exact founding date, but legend holds that officials from Padua established a trading post in what is now Venice to secure their commercial interests. On that very same day, a church, later identified as St. Giacomo de Rialto, was founded. So there could be a little bit of dramatic license with this, but it doesn't seem to be politically motivated at all. So there's no need to really make strong arguments against it. Let's just take it in our stride. However, there is historical and archaeological evidence that suggests that the church was actually constructed much later. And I mean much later. We're talking the 11th and the mid-12th century. And if we are going to take the establishment of the Republic of Venice on the date of the dedication of the city's first church, well, that throws us around 600 or 700 years out of whack, doesn't it? But regardless, the earliest settlement at Rialto, which is modern-day Rialto, is associated in the 11th century Chronicon Altinate with the dedication of the same church. So, of course, we have the legendary story, much like we have in Rome with Romulus and Remus. Well, Venice has a slightly less exciting one. But everybody wants to make their city seem a bit older than it actually is. Either way, according to long-held tradition, the first Venetians ever were refugees fleeing from successive waves of barbarian invasions. We're talking Huns, Lombards, Visigoths, all the bad guys if you ask the Romans. They were pouring into northeastern Italian mainland between the 2nd and the 5th centuries AD, and they were not the most respectful house guests. That is to say a little about it. They came from nearby Roman towns, these refugees, such as Padua, Aquileia, Treviso, Altinum, and many more. Many of those would form the original Venetian patrician lineages, trace their descent from the old Roman families. And then, of course, we go back a little bit further. The devastation wrought by the Quadi and Marcomanni in AD 166 to 168, and especially Attila and his Huns in 452, pushed the inhabitants of the mainland into the lagoon's safer and more defensible islands. And then we have the Lombard invasion in 568, further restricted the Byzantine or Eastern Roman territories to a narrow strip along the coast, and the lagoon dwellers became an increasingly distinctive community, defined by salt-making, fishing, and the careful engineering of embankments. And so, by the 7th century, as Byzantine power in northern Italy waned and Lombard pressure mounted, the lagoon settlements united to defend themselves, and they formed the Duchy of Venetia. Now this duchy encompassed the region stretching from the lagoon of Grado and Carol to the east of modern Venice, and included the patriarchal seats of Aquileia and Grado. It remained nominally under Byzantine authority, however. But it was its isolation that began to give it this growing autonomy. I mean, it was a bit of a pain to get to. I'm sure you can imagine. Even in our modern day, it's not that easy. Well, at least we have trains and everything else now. A set of leaders, known as the Tribuni Maiores, established the first central governing body of these lagoon islands. Eventually, the first ducal ruler recognized by both the local population and the Byzantine Empire emerged. Urso Hipparto, or Ursus, confirmed as Hipparchus and Dux titles formally recognized the union of local authority with Byzantine imperial sanction. According to an 11th century tradition by John the Deacon, there was an even earlier duke, Paolo Lucio Anafesto, who was chosen in AD 697. But this tradition is not very well substantiated. Now, early Doges, including those legendary figures, likely based their power in Heraclea, an older settlement among the lagoon region. In essence, Venice's origins were not marked by this single founding act or a clearly documented event. You see, rather they unfolded rather gradually as these scattered lagoon communities, first shaped by Roman and Byzantine traditions, then by the necessity of defending themselves against Lombards and other barbarians, began to forge this shared identity that was different from Roman, different from Greek. It was really something quite new. In Venice's earliest centuries, settlements in the lagoon did not yet focus on the Rialto Islands that would later form the city's core. Instead, some of the earliest known inhabited areas included Olivolo, at the lagoon's eastern end, that is, today's San Pietro in Castello, and it was a little bit closer to the sandbars. Archaeological evidence indicates Olivolo was inhabited by the 5th century, and its political importance is confirmed by the 6th and 7th century, mainly in Byzantine seals. It may have had a fortress as early as the 6th century, and by the late 8th century, Olivolo had become home to a bishopric, established under Doge Maurizio Galbaio, 764 to 787, and also a cathedral at San Pietro, completed in 841. Further underscoring the area's religious and political significance. I mean, you can't have a city without a cathedral, can't you? While evidence suggests that islands in the Rialto or Rialto group were settled early on, the serious urbanization of the Rialto region didn't really begin until the 9th century, and we'll get into that soon. But first we must mention that early Venetian leaders moved their seats of power among the lagoon's communities. Teodato Ipato, successor to Orso Ipato, transferred the ducal seat from Eraclio to Malamocco on the Lido in the 740s, reflecting the ongoing attempts to establish hereditary dynasties. But these attempts failed repeatedly due to internal factional struggles, shifting political alliances, and, well, the assassinations didn't really help either. Nothing messes up a dynasty like assassinations. By the early 9th century, Venice's political identity and independence had begun to solidify somewhat through all of its internal struggles and external challenges. Don't worry, there's still plenty of barbarians around, that's for sure. Perhaps they're not very good at swimming. Initially, factional alignments, pro-Byzantine, pro-Frankish. We're talking about the French side of things. This is moving into the time of Charlemagne, of course. Republican and even pro-Lombard. That caused frequent shifts in leadership. Attempts by the early Doges to found lasting dynasties invariably failed due to the complexity of these ever-shifting rivalries. It was never easy. I suppose it's never meant to be. But a turning point did come with the pro-Frankish faction's ascendancy under Doge Obelerio degli Antoneri in 804. Excuse me as I struggle through the names. Venice temporarily entered the Carolingian orbit as Obelerio welcomed the protection of Pepin, the son of Charlemagne. But there was a problem. The decision seems to have backfired somewhat, in the form of Pepin laying siege to Venice. Pretty much the worst thing that could have happened. But don't worry, there was a secret weapon that they didn't even know that they had. That was the lagoon's marshy environment, which unleashed disease on the Frankish forces, taking many of them out, without even needing to fight them. After 6 costly months, the army of Pepin retreated, and as for Pepin himself, he died not long after. Possibly, and, well, probably, from illnesses contracted during the siege. I mean, there's nothing worse than a humid, stinking marsh with all of its mosquitoes and all the rest of the filth that Mother Nature can bring up from that kind of climate. Well, of course, it was a big victory for Venice, especially going up against the Carolingians, a small city-state, versus what was effectively an empire. In defending itself against this threat, Venice demonstrated its ability to resist even the strongest. An agreement between the Byzantine Emperor Nicephorus and Charlemagne recognized Venice as part of the Byzantine sphere, and finally affirmed its trade rights. While Venice remained nominally subject to the Eastern Empire, both emperors implicitly acknowledged its de facto independence. Of course, this misadventure of Obelerio left Venice more united than ever before. The failure of outside powers to subdue the lagoon cemented its distinct position in Italy. With the city's independence secured, the Doges who followed could focus on development. It's time to make something of this place. And so, under the rule of Agnello Participazio, 810 to 827, and his two sons, Venice began to undergo significant transformations. Let us say that it's going through its adolescence, I suppose we can put it like that. The first thing that Agnello did was move the ducal seat from Malamocco to the Rialto Islands, still then lightly settled, not quite empty, but it was a move that signaled the beginning of the intensive urbanization in the heart of the lagoon. Bridges, canals, embankments, and fortified structures began to shape the future city, weaving its islands together and integrating them more deeply with the sea. This era saw a profound cultural and religious milestone when Agnello's son, Giustiniano, brought the relics of St. Mark the Evangelist from Alexandria to Venice, establishing St. Mark as the city's patron saint. Thus, by the mid-9th century, Venice had shed this fragile uncertainty of its early centuries, and was well on its way to becoming a stable, prosperous maritime republic, one guided by commerce, diplomacy, and political independence, all under its unique cultural identity, instead of conquest and war. But of course, this does not mean that Venice did not get its hands dirty from time to time. Well, it was also around this time that Venice had signed a trade agreement with the Holy Roman Emperor Lothair I, whose privileges were later extended by Otto I and secured the sea by fighting Saracen and Narentine pirates during the reign of Pietro Tredonico, the Participazio's successor. Tredonico's military might would influence the many later crusades and dominate the Adriatic for centuries to come. After his long and prosperous rule between 1837 and 64, the Participazio took over, and it seemed, though a dynasty might finally be established. Venice had pledged also not to purchase Christian slaves within the Carolingian Empire, or sell Christian slaves to Muslims in the Pactum Lothari of 840. Later, the Venetians started selling more Slavs and other non-Christian slaves from Eastern Europe. The Venetian slave trade was split up into multiple routes, including the Black Sea and the Balkan slave trade. Slave caravans made their way from Eastern Europe to Venice via Austria's Alpine passes. According to surviving records, male slaves, who were more common, were valued at much less than a female slave. In Venice and other major slave markets, castration houses emerged to meet the demand for eunuchs, which were particularly valuable. While the Republic of Venice attempted, but was unable at this time to help the Byzantines drive the Arabs out of Crotone in 841 by sending a fleet of 60 galleys, each carrying 200 men. And this would become a bit of a trend, that Venice is called upon for their naval help pretty much when anything goes wrong. Don't worry, they'll be charging for it. After all, they are businessmen. Cities in the Istrian region signed an oath of allegiance to Venetian governance under Pietro II Candiano in order to ensure safe passage to Venetian fleets and traders near Croatian Dalmatia, his father Pietro Candiano I tried to attack and destroy Marania, Pagania, or Narentines. The admiral of the Maranian navy captured and killed Candiano September 18th, 887. I'm sure it was not a quick death either. In an effort to secure the Dalmatian coast for Venice, he became the first and only Duke of Venice to die. Not the title that he wanted, I'm sure. Either way, after a revolt in 972 overthrew the autocratic Philo-Imperial Candiano dynasty, the people elected Doge Pietro I Orsiello. However, his conciliatory approach proved to be unpopular, and he resigned in favor of Vitale Candiano. Beginning with Pietro II Orsiello, who ruled from 991, the focus on the mainland was unquestionably eclipsed by a determined effort to gain control of the Adriatic Sea. The favorable treaty with Emperor Basil II quelled internal conflict and increased trade with the Byzantines by granting Venetian traders exemption from taxes paid by both the Byzantines and other foreigners. To combat Narentine pirates, a strong fleet set sail from Venice on Ascension Day in the year 1000. The fleet travelled to all the major Istrian and Dalmatian cities, where the populace swore allegiance to Venice after becoming weary of the conflicts between the Croatian king Svetoslav and his brother Kresimir. But despite their best efforts, the main Narentine harbours, Lagosta, Lisa, and Cruzola, were overrun and destroyed. The Narentine pirates vanished after being put down for good, and good riddance. Although Dalmatia was still officially ruled by the Byzantines, Orsiello became the Dux Dalmatiae, the Duke of Dalmatia, and this solidified Venice's dominance over the Adriatic Sea. In 1008, Orsiello finally passed away, and by 1017, when Venice had become a major player in the balance of power between the Byzantine and the Holy Roman Empires, an expedition led by Pietro's son Ottone further cemented Venice's dominance over the Adriatic. Venice did maintain its neutrality during the extended investiture controversy, an 11th century conflict between Pope Gregory VII and the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV over who would have authority over the appointment of church officials, which of course resulted in some loss of support from the popes. But you have to take a side, don't you? By gaining a bull declaring, well, a bull is kind of like a written censure that comes from the Pope, declaring Venetian supremacy along the Adriatic coast up to Durazzo, and granting his merchants tax exemption through the Byzantine Empire, Doge Domenico Selvo helped the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos win the war against the Normans of Apulia. This helped the city-state later amass wealth and power by acting as a middleman for the lucrative spice and silk trade that flowed through the Levant and Egypt along the Kingdom of Aksum and the Roman Indian routes via the Red Sea. And with that, the city achieved complete independence, even though the war was not really a military victory of sorts. Either way, Domenico Selvo led a fleet against the Normans in 1084, but he lost 9 great galleys, the biggest and most powerfully armed vessels in the Venetian navy, and he was ultimately defeated. Looks like the Normans were getting back on top. While Venice's domination of trade between Europe and the Levant made it wealthy from the High Middle Ages onward, and it started to spread into the Adriatic Sea and beyond, nearly from the start, Venice was involved in the Crusades. Following the First Crusade, 200 Venetian ships helped capture Syria's coastal cities, and in 1123, the Pactum Barmundi gave them virtual autonomy in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Well, as long as they had the Kingdom of Jerusalem in their hands, I suppose. Ordelafo Faliero personally led 100-ship Venetian fleet in 1110 to help Baldwin I of Jerusalem seize Sidon. The Venetian arsenal, a sizable national shipyard, was constructed by the Republic in the 12th century. The Republic seized control of the eastern Mediterranean by constructing new and potent fleets, with all the best new technology. To assist traders from throughout Europe, the world's first exchange company was also established in Venezia. In the Byzantine Empire, the Venetians also enjoyed great trading privileges, and their ships frequently served as the empire's navy. The Venetians were the primary victims of an anti-Catholic massacre too in 1182 by Constantinople's Orthodox Christian populace. Perhaps, maybe the memories of that were fresh in the Fourth Crusade. We shall see. The Doge Enrico Dandalo offered to postpone payment in exchange for the Crusaders' assistance in taking Zara, that is modern-day Zadar, which had rebelled against Venetian rule in 1183 and placed itself under the due protection of the papacy and King Emmerich of Hungary. This was mainly because the Crusaders were unable to pay for their chartering of their shipping, and Zara had proven too well defended for Venice to retake all on its own. They were going to need a bit of help with that one. You see, getting onto the ships was very easy for Venice, but doing anything off them, well, they had their moments. But this was a naval power. Let's not say that they were lining up and fighting people out on the fields. There's more than one way to win a war, you know. Well, back to it when this was achieved in 1202, taking Zara, that is. The crusade was once more redirected to the Byzantine capital, Constantinople. In exchange for the Crusaders helping to reinstall him as Emperor, Alexios IV Angelos offered them 10,000 Byzantine soldiers to aid in the crusade, 500 knights to be kept in the Holy Land, the assistance of the Byzantine navy, 20 ships to transport their army to Egypt, and 200,000 silver marks to help settle the Crusaders' debt to Venice. I mean, it all sounds pretty good, doesn't it? It's not a bad deal. So Alexios was reinstated to power in 1203 after the Crusaders agreed. But there was a problem. He failed to fulfill his end of the bargain. Yes, one of those turning points in history that really upsets me, actually. Well, in response to it, the great city of Constantinople was besieged by the Venetians and the French Crusaders, who took control of the city and sacked it in 1204. Several works of art, including the well-known 4 bronze horses, were actually saved from the sack and returned to Venice by the Venetians. Following the fall of the Byzantine hegemony, Venice acquired strategic lands in the Aegean Sea, which included the islands of Crete and Euboea, and accounted for 3/8 of the Byzantine Empire. Furthermore, the central architecture of some modern cities like Chania on Crete is largely Venetian in origin. It's still there too. You can take a good look at it. Hopefully it's as well preserved as I've seen in the photographs. There was also the Venetian Duchy of the Archipelago that was made in that same time from the Aegean Islands, and that little agreement that they signed with the Mongols in 1241 to facilitate trade. Of course, everybody was hoping that the Mongols would sweep in and win the crusade for them, but, well, that didn't really work out for either sides in any of the Crusades. Well, we move on now to the 14th century, where Venice encounters a few more challenges, particularly under Louis I of Hungary. He attempted, but failed, to free Zara from Venetian suzerainty for the first time in 1346. The Dukes of Austria, Nicholas, and the Patriarch of Aquileia, and his half-brother Emperor Charles IV, Louis I, Francesco I de Carrara, the Lord of Padua, and the Counts of Gorizia formed an alliance in 1356, and in that same year the League's forces took control of Grado and Muggia, and Louis deprived Venice of Dalmatia. His army had attacked the cities of Zara, Trau, Spalato, and Ragusa along the Dalmatian coast. Treviso's siege, which lasted from July to September of 1356, ended up being a complete and utter failure. After losing quite badly, well, very badly, at Nervesa on January 13th, 1358, Venice was compelled to leave Dalmatia and return it to the Kingdom of Hungary. On February 18th, 1358, the Treaty of Zara was signed, and the Venetians accepted the unfavorable terms it contained. Venice also engaged in sporadic warfare with the Genoese from 1350 to 1381, which was also a bit of a naval empire. You know what they say, this town ain't big enough for the both of us. At the expense of Genoa, the Venetians maintained their dominant position in the eastern Mediterranean affairs, after first defeating the Genoese fleet at the Battle of Chioggia in 1380. Nevertheless, the peace resulted in Venice losing a number of lands to other warring nations. For example, the Byzantine Empire seized Tenedos, the Austrians seized Conegliano, Carraresi seized Treviso, the Patriarch of Aquileia seized Trieste, and Serenissima lost Dalmatia to Hungary. Early in the 15th century, the Venetians increased their holdings in northern Italy and took total authority over the Dalmatian coast, which they had purchased from Ladislaus of Naples. To run the region, Venice appointed its own aristocrats, such as Count Filippo Stipanov in Zara. The Duke of Milan, Gian Galeazzo Visconti, threatened to expand, so the Venetians took action against him. To protect traveling merchants, authority over the northeast cross-country routes was also required, and by 1410 Venice had controlled most of Venetia, including major cities like Padua and Verona. And they also had a navy of about 3,500 ships and about 35,000 men. Not bloody bad, I will say. Now, this little situation in Dalmatia was solved by a truce in 1408 with Sigismund of Hungary. Venice had actually conquered the Patriarchate of Aquileia as soon as this truce expired, then capturing Durazzo, Spalato, Trau, and other Dalmatian cities. Hungary's challenges made it possible for the Republic to unite its Adriatic territories. And so, by the mid-15th century, under Doge Francesco Foccari, Venice attained the pinnacle of its mainland power, having carved out a substantial domain that stretched from the Veneto through the Friuli, Bergamo, and Cremona, all the way to Ravenna, Istria, and Dalmatia. The Peace of Lodi, 1454, provided the culminating settlement and acknowledged Venice's prominent position in northern Italy. Yet, this territorial expansion came just as the Republic faced grave maritime challenges from, guess who? The ascendant Ottoman Empire. Although Venice retained certain trade privileges after the fall of Constantinople in the previous year, 1453, the Ottoman push into Albania and the Aegean eroded Venetian outposts, culminating in the loss of Negropont in 1470. Efforts to counter the Ottomans through alliances with Persia and other European states produced limited results. And despite heroic defenses, like Antonio Loredan's at Scutari, Venice was forced into a peace treaty in 1479, surrendering critical strongholds and agreeing to pay annual tribute. This outcome reshaped the Republic's geopolitical stance, reducing its capacity for bold maritime ventures and cementing a more cautious, defensive posture. But even as the Ottomans challenged Venice's naval empire, the Republic remained deeply enmeshed in Italian politics. In contrast to major powers like Florence, Naples, and Milan, Venice supported Pope Sixtus IV in his 1482 offensive against Ferrara, an endeavor that backfired somewhat when the Pope reversed allegiances after the papal Venetian force suffered a setback at Campomorto. Although Venice suffered deaths, such as Alfonso of Calabria's victory in the Veronese, its maritime strength enabled it to seize Gallipoli on the Apulian coast. A shift in Milanese policy under Ludovico Sforza, who sided with Venice, paved the way for the Peace of Brescia in 1484, and this treaty allowed Venice to acquire the Polesine and Rovigo, enhancing its reputation in Italy, especially at the expense of Florence. In the following years, Venice undertook brief forays against Sigismund and Pope Innocent VIII, continuing to assert its influence on the peninsula. Its troops also joined the Italian League at the Battle of Fornovo in 1495 against King Charles VIII of France. An alliance with Spain, or more particularly with the Spanish region of Aragon, formed amid the reconquest of the Kingdom of Naples and secured Venetian control of the Ionian Islands, key Apulian ports, and other strategic positions controlling the lower Adriatic. Thus, by the end of the 15th century, Venice had adjusted its priorities, balancing a powerful mainland presence with a more guarded maritime stance, deftly engaging in Italy's complex political maneuvers and shifting alliances, all to maintain its stature as a formidable but now more cautious Mediterranean power. Long gone were the gutsy days of old. Well, with about 180,000 residents at the end of the 15th century, Venice was actually the second largest city in Europe. The first was Paris. But Venice was arguably the richest city in the world, and that was even despite the defeats in the war against the Turks. With 2.1 million people, the Republic of Venice's territory covered about 70,000 kilometers. That's about 27,000 square miles. And by contrast, at the same time, England only had about 3 million people. Italy as a whole had 11 million. France had 13 million, Portugal 1.7, Spain with 6, and the Holy Roman Empire, which was not very holy, not very Roman, and not much of an empire, still managed to have 10 million people, give or take. Of course, the region was split into 3 administrative sections. First, we have the domain of the Doge, and I can't stop thinking of that little Shiba dog when I say that word. Now, the Doge's domain was called the Dogado, which includes the city's islets and the original land surrounding the lagoon. Then we have Istria, Dalmatia, the Albanian coast, the Apulian ports, the Venetian Ionian coast, Crete, Cyprus, as well as fortifications and trading posts scattered through the southeast European region and the Middle East are all part of the Strato de Mar, that being the state of the sea. And then we have the state of the mainland, or Strato di Terraferma, which includes East Lombardy, Romagna, Friuli, Veneto, and Venetia Iulia. So those were the three domains: the Ducato, the state of the sea, and the state of the mainland. Venice also gained Cremona in 1499, when it sided with Louis XII of France against Milan. The Ottoman Sultan launched a land invasion of Lepanto that same year and dispatched a sizable fleet to aid in the naval assault. Antonio Grimani, who was more of a diplomat and businessman than a sailor, lost the Battle of Zonchio at sea in 1499, and Friuli was once again sacked by the Turks. Venice gave up the bases of Lepanto, Modon, and Coron because it preferred peace to full-scale conflict with the Turks, and one can hardly blame them. The Turks were on a bit of a roll at that time. During the early 16th century, Venice faced grave challenges as it struggled to maintain its wealth, influence, and independence. Although its economy had flourished on maritime trade and the production of fine goods, such as silks, jewelry, gold articles, delicate glassware, etc., political pressure pulled the Republic away from its traditional commercial focus. Now, one major concern was the situation in Romagna, formerly a papal territory, but in reality divided into numerous lordships that neither Rome nor Venice could easily control. Under Pope Julius II's leadership, a coalition known as the League of Cambrai 1508 was formed against Venice, uniting the Pope with Spain, France, Emperor Maximilian I, and the King of Hungary. Of course, each power sought a share of the Venetian territories. Apulian ports were promised to Spain, Cremona to France, Dalmatia to Hungary, Friuli and Veneto to Maximilian, and Romagna essentially to papal suzerainty. By the early 16th century, Venice's attempts at territorial expansion on the Italian mainland had pretty much came to a decisive end. The dramatic defeat in 1509 at Anadello and the subsequent 7 years of wars forced Venice to release its ambitions and focus on preserving what little it had left. Though a combination of successions, like ceding Apulian ports to Spain, and judicious diplomacy, the Republic managed to recover its mainland territories up to the Ada River. Yet the events of 1509 effectively signaled a transition from outward-looking aggression to a determined and more inward-focused stability. You see, this new stance went hand in hand with reflections on Venice's constitution and governance. Intellectuals like Gasparo Contarini praised the city's balanced political system, uniting elements of monarchy, democracy, and oligarchy in a way that seemed to impress a lot of the foreign observers. But there were some who weren't on that same team. Local observers, such as Marino Sanudo, noted increasing internal corruption and fierce competition among the impoverished noble families. Thus, while Venice's political arrangements were much admired, there was her masked growing tensions and inequalities within the patrician class. On the political stage, on a global scale, the end of French-Spanish rivalries in Italy left Venice caught between two commanding forces, that being Spanish Habsburg dominance on land and the Ottoman Empire's surging naval power. Venice adopted a cautiously neutral approach, collaborating minimally with Spain to avoid strengthening Madrid's hand too much, but it couldn't wholly disengage from the regional conflicts. It was too close to home. Decisions had to be made. During 1537 to 1540, their war against the Ottomans continued. Venice allied with Charles V and Spain. The defeat of the Allied fleets at the Battle of Preveza, 1538, a crushing blow administered under the Ottoman skilled naval leadership, guaranteed the new Ottoman naval supremacy. By 1540, Venice was forced to relinquish the control of the Duchy of Naxos, reflecting the Republic's shrinking maritime ambitions and its shift to a more defensive posture. And so, against this backdrop of changing fortunes, and perhaps lost fortunes too, Venice still managed to remain independent and resourceful. But they faced an altered reality. You see, this era of confident expansion and uncontested maritime dominance had faded. Instead, the Republic aimed to maintain a more careful balance, navigating the Spanish-dominated Italian peninsula and an eastern Mediterranean ruled by Ottoman fleets. The period also brought changes to Venice's own maritime practices. You see, until 1545, the Republic's galleys relied on free, paid oarsmen, initially Venetians themselves, but over time supplemented by Dalmatians, Cretans, and Greeks. Labor shortages and growing logistical difficulties led Venice, like other maritime powers, to turn to conscription and forced rowers chained to the oars. The first Venetian to command such a galley was Cristoforo de Canal. By 1563, Venice's population had dropped to about 168,000, showing a broader demographic and economic strain as the Republic sought to safeguard its sovereignty amid formidable challenges. And during this prolonged struggle against the Ottomans in the later 16th century, the Republic formed the Holy League of 1570, together with Spain and the papacy, to face a renewed Turkish threat. Commanded by Don John of Austria, with Venice under Sebastiano Venier, the League's fleet of over 200 galleys matched the Ottoman armada in strength. Finally, they had a chance to fight back. Though the Christians won a renowned victory at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, the triumph had faced a few strategic dividends. Well, not very many for Venice at least. Spanish priorities prevented a follow-up offensive in the Levant, and the loss of Cyprus, where the Ottomans had seized Famagusta and savagely executed its Venetian commander, was confirmed by the peace treaty in 1573. As the Republic came to term with these setbacks, Venice's population declined from around 175,000 in 1575 to roughly 124,000 in 1581. That's only in the space of 6 years. Now that is catastrophic. So in 1605, Venice's efforts to limit the Church's temporal influence sparked a direct confrontation with the papacy. 2 clergymen were arrested for minor offenses, and Venice passed a law restricting the Church's ownership of land, and the Church was not going to like that, weren't they? So Pope Paul, of course, regarded these as infringements of canon law, and thus placed Venice under interdict. However, under Doge Leonardo Dona, the city refused to yield, ignoring the ecclesiastical sanctions and continuing religious life as normal, just basically ignoring the Pope completely. Once again, he wasn't going to like that. Paolo Sarpi, a theologian and advisor to the government, strongly defended the Republic's stance, and after a year of stalemate, the French managed to mediate a compromise. Venice got to maintain its principle that no citizen was exempt from state law, while the Pope lifted the interdict. Still, it didn't make them look very good in the eyes of the papacy. Agreements notwithstanding, memories are harder to sign off on paper. From 1613 to 1617, Venice had another crisis to deal with. This time, it focused on the Adriatic and its long-standing claim to dominion over the Gulf. The Austrian Habsburgs had settled Uzkoks, Christian refugees turned maritime raiders along the coast. Their piracy threatened Venetian trade and risked souring relations with the Ottoman Empire. When Venice acted against the Uzkoks, she found herself confronting the Austrian Archduke, who protected them. Venice financed operations against Austria's possessions and leaned on Savoy to divert Spanish forces. Finally, the peace settlement of 1617 forced the Habsburgs to relocate the Uzkoks inland, but the broader eastern frontier disputes remained inconclusive. Well, in that same year, the Spanish Viceroy of Naples sent a naval squadron into the Adriatic to challenge Venice's maritime supremacy, perhaps independently or with the express support from Madrid. Either way, it was mixed results, and they decided to withdraw, but tension lingered. Within Venice, mercenaries of various nationalities employed in the Gradisca campaign brawled, and rumors of conspiracies began to spread. The Spanish ambassador, the Marquis of Bedmar, was implicated, if not indeed, then by association. A Huguenot captain warned the Venetian Council of 10, prompting swift actions. 3 bravos, which is a word for hired killers or conspirators, were hanged, and the Senate demanded the immediate recall of the Spanish ambassador, averting a potential coup or sedition plot. In these events, ranging from maritime wars and grand alliances to diplomatic standoffs and personal intrigues, Venice continued to display its tenacity and subtlety. The city's power on the seas faced persistent tests, both from the Ottomans and from European rivals like Spain. The Republic's careful navigation of these crises, including defying the papacy and exposing conspiracies, shows their commitment to preserving its sovereignty and a unique political tradition in an increasingly contested world. But by the late 16th and into the 17th centuries, the fortunes of Venice continued to fluctuate. The Republic, having survived the upheavals following the League of Cambrai and the wars of the early 1500s, still faced the ongoing tensions, most prominently with Spain and the Ottoman Empire. Internally, the execution and posthumous rehabilitation of Antonio Foscarini in 1622 revealed how deep and dangerous the Venetian-Spanish rivalries had become. In the early decades of the 17th century, Venice reasserted itself in Italian affairs for the first time in a century. The succession in Mantua and Montferrat after Duke Ferdinando I Gonzaga's death shifted the balance of power in northern Italy again. Venice took France's side against the Spanish-aligned powers, hoping to prevent Spanish hegemony from hardening any further. But this gamble backfired. Better luck next time, kid. Venice's attempts to aid besieged Mantua failed, and the brutality of the city's sack underscored the Republic's weakened position on the Italian mainland. The comeback had failed. And then, of course, there was a devastating plague in 1630 that claimed a third of Venice's population. Now that ought to hit them pretty hard. It strained the Republic's resources, and though Venice erected the magnificent church of Santa Maria della Salute in gratitude for the plague's end, The demographic and economic toll was, well, that problem was not going to be solved by building a giant church now, wasn't it? Meanwhile, Venetian naval supremacy faced renewed challenges. Corsairs from the Barbary states, allied loosely with the Ottomans, raided the Adriatic in 1638, provoking a Venetian counterstrike. The Ottomans, offended by Venetian attacks near their strongholds, arrested the Venetian bailo in Constantinople. Diplomacy managed to prevent immediate war, but it proved only to be a temporary reprieve. In 1645, the Ottomans attacked Crete, Venice's great overseas possession, ushering in the long and grueling Cretan War. How long? Well, it lasted between 1645 and 1669. That's too long. Venice's Adriatic defences generally held, thanks to superior sea power, but Crete's strategic port of Canda, also known as Heraklion, came under relentless Ottoman siege. Venetian strategy focused on blockading the Dardanelles to interrupt the Ottoman supply lines. Despite some notable successes, such as victories in 1655 and 56, Venice could not decisively cut off the Ottomans' lifeline. With European allies providing only limited and, frankly, inconsistent help, and attempts to relieve Candia failing, Venice finally had no choice but to capitulate in 1669. It surrendered nearly the entire island, except for a few minor bases. The loss of Crete ended Venice's days as a great Levantine power, although it did keep the Dalmatian territories taken during the war and retained Tinos and Kergo in the Aegean, but, well, once they lost Crete, it was pretty much most of the nails in the coffin. But don't worry, there's a few more final nails in the coffin. The very sad and slow death of Venice is only just getting on its way. Well, in the late 17th century, things shifted again after the Ottomans' failed siege of Vienna in 1683. Venice joined Austria, and eventually Russia in a new Holy League. Under Captain General Francesco Morosini, Venetian forces achieved dramatic successes in the Mauryan War, seizing Lefkas and dominating the Peloponnese, briefly resurrecting its maritime dominion in the Greek waters, but I do say briefly. Morosini's campaigns saw Venice at Athens, where a cannon shot famously caused the Parthenon's partial destruction. Thanks for that, you can blame Morosini for that one. Although Venetian possessions in Dalmatia expanded, attempts to retake key islands like Negropoint failed. Ultimately, at the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, the fruits of Morosini's victories were overshadowed by Austria and Russia's larger gains at Ottoman expense. Venice, after nearly a 2-century struggle against the Turks, ended up with less than it had once possessed. The Republic remained a resilient maritime state, but the ambitious imperial reach of the Middle Ages and Renaissance had long since diminished. By the close of the 17th century, Venice was a seasoned survivor, its diplomatic finesse intact, but the empire reduced and its strategic options increasingly constrained by the emergent great powers of Europe and the inexorable rise of the Ottomans. The issue of Spanish succession was another source of a new conflict. In 1700, both France and the Habsburg Empire sent envoys with authorities to Venice in an effort to establish an active ally. Instead of accepting fictitious benefits from the interested parties, the Venetian government chose to maintain its neutrality. Despite its inevitable decline, the Republic lived out its days in a luxury that was well known throughout Europe, remaining true to its policy of neutrality into the very end. The kingdom of the Morea on the Peloponnese, Venice's principal overseas possession, was without any of those supplies which are so desirable even in countries where aid is near at hand, which are not liable to attack from the sea. When the Turks declared war on them and the Republic in December of 1714, people started to panic. The islands of Tinos and Aegina were captured by the Turks, who then crossed the isthmus and captured Corinth. The Venetian fleet's commander, Daniel Dolfin, which is a great name for a naval commander, believed that saving the fleet was preferable to risking it for Morea. By the time he reached the scene, Malvasia, Coron, Modon, and Nauplia had all fallen. The Ionian islands of Lefkas and the Crete base of Spinalonga and Suda, which were still under Venetian control, were actually completely deserted. When the Turks finally touched down on Corfu, its defenders were able to drive them away. Meanwhile, on August 3rd, 1716, the Austrians had decisively defeated the Turks at Petrovaradin. However, new Venetian naval attempts in the Dardanelles and the Aegean in 1717 and 18, they weren't very successful. Austria gained a lot of territory with the Treaty of Passorowitz, 21st of July, 1718. But Venice lost the Morea, for which her meager gains in Albania and Venetian Dalmatia were hardly enough. This was the Republic's final conflict with Turkey. Livorno, a new port on the Tyrrhenian Sea established by the Grand Dukes of Tuscany and selected as a staging post for the British trade in the Mediterranean, contributed to Venice's decline in the 18th century in addition to Genoa, its long-standing rival. Even more harmful were the Habsburg Trieste, a free port in the Adriatic Sea since 1719, and the papal town of Ancona, which no longer qualified as a Venetian Gulf. A prominent Venetian politician of the time stated, "Apart from the residue which is left to us, Ancona robs us of the trade from both the Levant and the West, and from Albania and the other Turkish provinces. Trieste takes nearly all the rest of the trade which comes from Germany." Even the eastern mainland cities, including Verona, relied on Leghorn and Genoa for their supplies. The situation was made worse by the presence of pirates again from the Maghreb coast. Carlo Contarini, declared in the Maggior Consiglio in December 5th, 1779, "Everything is in disorder. Everything is out of control." He was referring to a commotion calling for reform plan that Giorgio Pisani also supported. In order to benefit the vast majority of the poor patricians, the monopoly of power, held by a select few wealthy patricians, was to finally be eliminated. Fears of overturning the system consequently arose, and Paolo Rainier, the Doge, was of course against the plan. The final Venetian naval expedition took place between 1784 and 1786, following demands for compensation for losses incurred by Tunisian subjects in Malta, losses that were not caused by the Venetians. The Bay of Tunis pirates resumed their piracy. The government, what was left of it, was compelled to use force after the diplomatic attempts to come to a consensus failed. Sus, Sfax, and La Goleta and Bizerta were all bombarded by a fleet led by Angelo Imo when it blockaded Tunis. The Senate called Imo and his fleet back to Corfu after these outstanding military triumphs failed to produce any comparable political outcomes in their turn. The Bey's dues were raised in order to make peace with Tunis following his passing. The once vast Venetian merchant fleet had shrunk to just 309 merchantmen by 1792. Remember when I told you they had 36,000 at one point? Good Lord. Of course, by 1796, the Republic was completely unable to defend itself. The army was composed of only a few brigades of mostly Dalmatian mercenaries, and the Republic still had a fleet of 13 ships of the line, but only a small number of men were prepared for the sea. Piedmont fell in the spring of 1796, and the Austrians were mounted from Montenot to Lodi. Napoleon's army pursued the enemy across the boundaries of neutral Venice. By the year's end, the French were occupying the French state all the way to the Adige. The Austrians controlled Vicenza, Cadore, and Friuli. Napoleon's next year's campaign were directed towards the Austrian territories on the other side of the Alps. The Austrians were supposed to accept the Venetian possessions in payment for peace in the preliminary stages of the Peace of Leoben, the details of which were kept a secret. However, the peace called for the Venetian state to continue to exist, albeit limited to the city and a lagoon, possibly in exchange for compensation from the Papal States. Meanwhile, anti-French movements were growing elsewhere, and Brescia and Bergamo went in all-out rebellion against Venice. On the 9th of April, Napoleon issued a war threat. He said, "I want no more Inquisition, no more Senate. I shall be an Attila to the state of Venice," he declared to the Venetian delegates in Grasse on April 25th. A French ship attempting to break in from the Lido forts was shot at by Domenico Pisamano, and Napoleon declared war on the 1st of May. At the lagoon's edge were the French, and they had even revolutionized the cities of Veneto, creating temporary municipalities. A motion to transfer power to the system of the proposed provisional representative government was approved by Magior Consiglio, on May the 12th, despite the lack of a quorum. 512 votes in favor, 10 against, 5 abstained. The Magior Consiglio Hall hosted a meeting of the interim municipal government on May 16th, and the Treaty of Campo Formio made the preliminary terms of the Peace of Leoben even more severe, and Venice, with all of her possessions, were annexed by Austria. On October the 18th, 1797, the agreement was signed in the last Doge's villa at Passariano, and just like that, with a whimper and a slow close of the door, our history of Venice comes to an end.
All right, well, I hope you liked the history of Venice. What a charming place. Hope I get to go there and have a look. Apparently they don't like tourists very much, but, well, bad luck, I'm going anyway. I'll be on my best behavior. I promise. So thank you very much. To the patrons and supporters, I'll list them off now in no particular order. It's Doc, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitimus, Carrie, Charlene, Linteries, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfednir. It's a pretty metal name, isn't it? Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, he's on YouTube, go check him out, Scott, Stark Factory, Shell, and Wendy. Thank you very much, and I will see you in the next video. If you like this one, then let me know, and maybe I'll do a history of Genoa, or is it Genoa? Good night, everyone. Lots of love to you all.